Hello, welcome to Palladium's first digital salon. I'm your host, Wolf Tivey, senior editor at Palladium magazine. We're joined today by Matt Parlmer and Will Eden and a selected audience of friends and governance futurists. Hi guys, welcome to the show.
Hey.
Hey there.
So for a bit of explanation before we get started, we're all in quarantine, so we're unable to run proper in-person events. So instead, we've decided to do online events for the foreseeable future. So this is our first foray into that world, doing a digital salon. The salon will be recorded, released like a podcast. So you may be listening to this as a podcast. And the plan basically is I'm going to moderate a discussion between Will and Matt about our topic for about half an hour, and then we're going to open it up to questions from our audience. So before we get started, I'd like to introduce our participants. First of all, we have Will Eden, who has previously worked at the Federal Reserve as an economist. He's previously worked at Teal Capital doing biotech venture capital. He's been one of the loudest and earliest alarm raisers on this whole coronavirus situation. He's been at the forefront of a lot of the key advocacy points, social distancing, hospital capacity, bunch of stuff like that. So, we're all very grateful to Will for helping to raise the alarm on this and help contain the issue. And I think as a point of pride, he's been in quarantine much longer than the rest of us.
Yeah, I started about 2 weeks before I was supposed to.
Great, excellent. Yeah, I think I was perhaps a week after you, but yeah, we're all in it now. Anyways, so then we have Matt Parlmer. He's a software entrepreneur who's been loud and early talking about supply chain risk and stepping up to actually start working on a project in that space, working on manufacturing personal protective equipment in the United States by any means necessary. And so, Matt, anything else you want to add before we get started?
Yeah, right now we're so I'll be transparent. I'm just going to pitch everybody. I don't know if there's anybody on here who can deploy six figures of capital.
Well, we're also broadcasting, so in the podcast, so the audience is potentially much larger than just the immediate audience.
All right, good deal. Well, to everybody listening, I'm working with several colleagues to spin up a mass manufacturer, an N95 mass manufacturing facility in Grand Rapids, Michigan, using spare capacity at a couple different plants they have there. We have identified a supplier of the extremely scarce and extremely difficult to find melt-blown polypropylene filter material. And we are currently in need of capital from anybody who is feeling like they want to be effective with their altruism.
Anyone who wants to be a hero, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. Our goal is to onshore as much PPE manufacturing capacity as possible because we consider this to be a national defense priority, in my opinion. And also a bit of a national disgrace that this doesn't exist. That this doesn't exist in the first place. So if that's something you're interested in helping out with, please reach out to me or one of the organizers of this stream on Twitter, and we'll get linked up.
Wow. Yeah. So we're all very grateful to you for running that kind of project. Is definitely the kind of thing we need right now.
Don't thank me yet. We haven't done anything.
Right. Well, no, you've been trailblazing and showing the way for a lot of people.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. So the reason I wanted to bring you guys together is to talk about generally the disconnect between the online community of epistemically astute amateurs and the official experts. I think we've seen a fairly significant disconnect there that's been showing up in multiple ways. And I want to talk about, additionally, what we have and have not been able to do despite lack of institutional power. So there's a lot of people who have been really calling this the way it was going to play out, and knew what was going to happen, and were unable to move through official institutional channels, but a lot of stuff was done nonetheless. So this is the general topic that I wanted to get you guys to weigh in on. So how did this look from our perspective in these strange circles on the internet who seem to know everything before the experts do? And what have we been doing? So Matt, you've given us your little pitch on what you've been up to. Mm-hmm. Will, can you give us kind of an overview of some of the advocacy that you've been doing, and how you saw it play out? When did this first kind of really become your thing? When did you start Corona posting, Will?
I probably should have checked when I actually changed my name on Twitter to say that, which I think was probably in late February, early March. But yeah, I started following the situation in China mid to late January. And it's a little bit hard to sort of remember what was going through my head at the time, but I think the thing that really tipped me off was that it was spreading asymptomatically. And as soon as I heard that, my first thought was like, wow, this is going to be really hard to contain. Right. You know, at that time, it was still pretty much only in Wuhan. It was only a few hundred cases. And so it started a little bit as a curiosity. The first thing I did was was like, hey, okay, so this is like pretty similar to SARS. How did SARS play out? Well, SARS spread to quite a few countries, but it ultimately did get contained. So for a while, my thinking was, you know, it's bad that this is happening, but we're probably going to be okay. Because I basically thought that institutions were a little more capable than they turned out to be. Yeah. The other thing too, though, is SARS was mostly only transmitted symptomatically. And so right off the bat, we knew that this would be harder to contain. Didn't make it impossible to contain, but just much, much harder. So, you know, it started as this like intellectual curiosity. And I think even after it started to get bad in China, but it hadn't really spread kind of like throughout the world in a serious way yet. By like, you know, the middle of February, it was clear that China had really cracked down and was like actually turning the corner on it. You know, it was clear by like mid-February that like maybe China was actually going to get this thing under control. So from like, I mean, look, like I thought then like, okay, we have a model that works. It's not that widespread yet. We've got this under control. That turned out to be very, very wrong.
Right. So when did you realize you were wrong there?
Yeah, so it started taking off in South Korea. Right. And it still sort of felt like, okay, that's unfortunate, but probably still containable via similar methods. Like still at this point, Singapore had contained it, Hong Kong had contained it, Taiwan had contained it. So it started to blow up in South Korea, but even then it was like, okay, well, we still have this playbook, and South Korea did end up doing different things. It still seemed to be effective, even though their strategy was somewhat different, which again sort of gave me hope, right? But then basically seeing the complete sort of failure of the West to respond, and then starting to see this exponential takeoff. Someone in the chat says I changed my name on March 3rd, which feels right. So I would say the other really big flag for me was finding out that it was in Iran and that it was going uncontrolled spread in a country without, you know, the best healthcare and monitoring. At that point, I became very, very, very concerned. Because even if every other country in the world successfully contained it, if you have one that's basically this like viral reactor, right, that's like throwing off tons of cases.
Where they're still licking the shrine.
Yep, exactly. And very soon after it became obvious to the outside world that it was in Iran, every country that bordered them showed cases just going like this. Every single country, right?
Yeah.
So after Iran came out, that's when I was like, this could be, you know, much, much worse, and probably we're not going to contain it, at least there, right? But yeah, a lot of countries just continued to drop the ball, and with each like increasing week, I was like more frantic, and I've been pretty much only posting about it nonstop for 2 weeks or more now.
Okay. Yeah. So what did it look like with respect to, you're watching the situation develop on the ground in these other countries like China and Iran and South Korea. And then how did that contrast, like your level of alarm contrast with sort of the stories you were hearing domestically here in the United States?
Yeah, zero correlation.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, as recently as like 1 month ago, you had the media making fun of folks in Silicon Valley for starting to like do some social distancing measures,
Right.
right? Which in retrospect is a very bad look. I think a lot of people are going to obviously have a lot of egg on their face, or should, right?
Yeah, I think we've seen quite a bit of that actually. There's a few screen cap comparisons going around now of the media making fun of the issue like a month ago, and then now calling the people who are denying it conspiracy theorists when they were denying it a month ago. And yeah, so it's been interesting to see the sort of official information institutions just like flip-flopping manufacturing narrative real time in ways that in retrospective seemed extremely irresponsible.
So in fairness, I think we started to see this the most blatantly with Trump. Like he can just turn on a dime and just change his story and then pretend like he talked that way the whole time. And I think everyone in the country has basically just become this, if they weren't before. I'm not totally convinced that it didn't always work like this. It was just never so like blatantly obvious, and maybe have so many people online calling out how inconsistent and how just completely hypocritical this whole thing has been.
Yeah. So Matt, how did it look from your perspective? I remember I looked, you had one very important tweet, I think in 23rd of January or something, where you were talking about the supply chain implications of this whole thing. And that's been pretty well borne out and more. So what did this look like from your perspective? Kind of how did you get onto the issue? How's your thinking changed, and how's that contrasted with the narratives you
Right.
see?
So a lot of this goes back to me obsessively following open source intelligence channels for the last several years. My interest in things like Bellingcat and various other sort of open ways of aggregating a bunch of information, such that you have, for Twitter at least, something comparable to a nation state intelligence agency, just happening there in the feeds. That it was always an appealing and interesting thing for me. So those organizations started to target the Hong Kong protests middle of last year, started aggregating tons of information, started distributing it all over the place, and I'd been obsessively following that. And those same channels started to report in late December lots and lots of viral pneumonia among relatives in central China. And to anybody who follows, another thing I'm obsessively following, this will be a pattern here. Anybody who follows sort of epidemiological channels knows that whenever you hear about, interesting spike in viral pneumonia in central China, it's generally not a good sign.
Right.
So, yeah, exactly. So basically, the alarm bells were going, right around then. We now know, based on Kaishin's excellent reporting, that it was indeed spreading all the way back then. That the PRC government knew about it and was hiding information on it. So that started to break out into the Hong Kong channels for like open source intelligence, the OSINT world. After that, one of the first people on that was a guy on Twitter who goes by the name Comparativist. I definitely recommend following him, Trey. So that started to break out, and it became clear to me that given the fact that PRC since the opening has been a huge exporter of people all over the world, that that, COVID would start moving along those networks very quickly in a way that was very difficult to contain if we didn't start taking measures immediately. So around that period of time, I started to.
Let me just interrupt you here, Matt.
Yeah, go ahead.
What was the Twitter account you just mentioned? It was a little bit unclear.
Comparativist.
Comparativist. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Tanner just linked to it in the show notes.
Great. Excellent. Okay.
Yeah. How's it going, Tanner? Tanner's feed also, if you want to follow interesting things in China, his feed's also quite good. Yeah. Scholar's Stage. So started seeing that sort of thing pop up all over the place. And it was interesting because, our first line of defense for a lot of these outbreaks is the quite excellent international sort of biological perimeter defense that the various different virology organizations out there have established. That's how we can figure out that some random village in Uganda has a novel relative of Ebola popping up all over the place. We're getting awfully good at finding random hemorrhagic fevers in the jungle. So it shouldn't be that hard to find a new coronavirus in a developed country like China. It was from that point onward that I started trying to raise the alarm bells in whatever minimal way that I could, and it's been awfully frustrating to watch all of the institutions, particularly the press, whose job it is to be ahead of the curve on stuff like this, just ignore it completely as it continued to get worse every single day.
Yeah. So speaking of the press kind of not being ahead of this thing and not catching everybody up to how serious the situation was, what are your guys' estimations on how much was that narrative management and how much was that like deliberate, planned sort of narrative management, and how much of that was just they were not kind of good enough at their job?
I personally think it's because they were not very good at their job. It's the kind of thing that I think without a little bit of expertise in the subject, it's a little bit hard to see just from like looking at a headline number, like, oh, how many hundred people have it? How many countries is it in? Like, it just continues to sound like a small deal, right? Without having the kind of underlying causal model of how these things actually spread.
Yeah, like I guess if you're not used to thinking about sort of the exponential process spreading through a network and, thinking through the process of how it's actually going to get stopped. You look at, there's a couple hundred cases in China of this novel pneumonia. It's like, it doesn't seem like a big deal, right? And then some hated tech bros in Silicon Valley are making a big deal out of it and refusing to shake hands. And of course, this becomes a point that you can make fun of them on.
I think sorry,
go for it, Matt.
Yeah, I think the press is just bad at relaying specialist or frankly just understanding specialist information in general, and that is that is in the sense that they're conditioned to do a lot of just regurgitation of people who are considered to be experts. In this case, the expertise that they were turning to were a bunch of public health bureaucrats who absolutely do have an incentive to claim that all is well and that everything is under control. And, they just continue to do that again and again and again. I do think there was some narrative management, though. I do absolutely think that's the case. I think that there are a lot of people who have particularly ever since the 2016 election, this orientation towards explicit attempts to prevent actors that they see as destabilizing to the current order from spreading what they consider to be disinformation. You can see that with Twitter's active like Weibo style spiking of communications about coronavirus. Yesterday, you literally cannot link to certain websites. Your tweets and DMs will get deleted. It's an active attack on the informational immune system that people like Balaji and other folks who were raising the alarm bells about this constitute. So yeah, I do think there's some active narrative management going on there. There are a lot of people who really like the idea that the authorities are always right, and those people they have blood on their hands, straight up.
Yeah, I mean, I think by now it looks fairly clear that they are definitely trying to manage public perceptions here, especially with, stock market worries and election worries and all, the general kind of political order concerns that you were talking about, and sort of perception of political order concerns. And I'm wondering sort of when it flipped from sort of incompetence to narrative management, or whether it sort of had elements of both sort of the whole time. Another thing I'd like to raise here actually is we need to disaggregate kind of official institutions and official experts here a bit, because from what I understand, the epidemiologists and the actual scientific community was
Yes.
quite on top of the thing.
Right.
And it was
Right.
the public health,
Totally.
it was the bureaucrats that were not, or were keeping it under wraps, and the journalists.
I was literally getting into flame wars with people, telling them, listen, like, there's absolutely evidence that this is going on. And I would get a reply like, no, the public health authorities say that this is fine. I would link directly to a virology paper, or directly to the interview with the Kaishan, the very excellent independent news agency in China. The interview that Kaishan did with the guy who managed the SARS response in PRC, saying that this was the worst outbreak of his lifetime. And
right. Wow.
I would get blocked or poo-pooed. It's ridiculous. Right. People can't, there's so much conditioning around what people, want to go. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. And yeah, there's this big disconnect. I think one of the ways this was put well and articulated well is there's this big disconnect between people who are reasoning directly about the evidence and directly about the models and directly trying to model the situation, and people who are reasoning primarily in terms of authorities and established kind of lines of information flow and so on. And you've seen this big disconnect, the Silicon Valley, a lot of technical people, a lot of people who are really pressed up against reality with their companies and the things they're working on, tended to be more on the side of raising the alarm because they were directly reasoning about the problem, and the kind of the established informational channels tended to be dominated by people who were thinking in terms of the informational authority, and the sort of top informational authorities were not raising the alarm for whatever reason. And so that whole system kind of ended up failing. But if I can briefly defend the idea that there ought to be, a lot of people taking seriously the official information authorities, it is kind of necessary in a society that you have someone somewhere sorting through all the possible discourse that's happening and saying, here are the things that are important, here are the things you need to be paying attention to. And that, there's a reason that a lot of people kind of end up following those authorities. And I guess the situation we're in is we end up having a crisis of either competence or will or good intention among those authorities right now. We're having, something's gone wrong there.
So I do think that that my thinking has changed on this a little bit, just sort of seeing how folks have started to respond now that the public health authorities are more kind of on board. I'm starting to think the government was actually more constrained than I had thought by the people. I basically think there's sort of a feedback loop here, right? Where the government can't really tell people that they have to take drastic action until the people are panicking.
Yeah.
And then to some degree, the people aren't going to panic until they're told something is wrong. And so my read of the last couple of weeks has actually been this sort of slow unrolling of hey, public, it's a little more serious. Hey, it's a little bit more serious. Hey, it's starting to get really serious now. Hey, it's really serious. We need to take drastic action now, right?
Yeah, and so there's sort of the interlocked, very constrained system hypothesis that you're laying out. Another hypothesis I've heard on sort of explaining that slow rollout is that's actually part of the narrative management. Is you don't want to just say okay, the government is going to take decisive action to kind of limit and contain this issue before anyone has any clue what's going on. That's very authoritarian. That's very China. We're not like that.
Yeah, of course.
We sort of do things as a public discourse, and so we take it much slower, just as a matter of like kind of our ideological precepts. And
So I will
perhaps
say,
those are related.
That may be the case, but I do think that they should have been telling people to panic back when a modicum of public alarm would have actually done a lot of good and kept this crap out of the country, or really out of the not really out of the country. It's not the that's not the big thing you need to worry about, but more like out of the air transport network.
Yeah.
If people had actually been listening to extremely credible, scientific minds working on this back in the very beginning of January, and been making sensible policy on the basis of that, we would have closed flights to China in mid-January. We would have basically done everything the Singaporean government has done. Or at least given people the opportunity to respond in a collective fashion, like the people of Hong Kong. So, it's not that either of those models are wrong. It's that we need we need to have an information infrastructure that allows us to actually drop into one of those models quickly during crises. And right now, we just don't have that.
So I will note that Trump did close air traffic to China, and everyone gave him a ton of crap for it, right? He was doing it later than we probably should have stopped that traffic, and the public was not ready for that, right? I think that's some evidence for this theory of mine that people needed to be a little bit more scared before we could actually take serious action. And then on the flip side, I've been really surprised actually how much supposedly half the country hates Trump and think that he's Hitler, right? But they're waiting for him for guidance about what to do during a pandemic.
Yeah, and that's the Democratic politicians included. I remember hearing some rumors about that. It was interesting.
Yeah, he still for whatever reason is the national figure that everyone expects to be sort of taking point on how we respond to and think about this crisis.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is he didn't change his mind until one story is that Tucker Carlson went and talked to him and said, look, this is actually really serious, and actually got him to change his mind, which is interesting. So there's this question of how constrained are the public authorities by the degree to which the public just wouldn't accept sort of decisive action here. And we see this with the sort of spring break types, and you've seen a lot of people with these sort of narrowly libertarian kind of responses to the thing of we don't need the government to help us with this. We don't, this is not something that they should be doing, or I don't care. I'm not worried for myself or whatever. There's just been quite a bit of public disobedience, though sort of orders have not actually been given as well because of the possibility of public disobedience, but just general disarray in the sort of natural chain of command there. And I think that's what you're kind of bringing up is the government is actually constrained by the people and have to kind of bring them along, which is a slow and painstaking process in a crisis like this.
Yeah.
Another issue that sort of speaks to sort of how much this is kind of just an informational system problem versus a general institutional decay problem is the testing and personal protective equipment availability problems. We have not been able to spin up testing, and we have not had the supply chains worked out on personal protective equipment. And these are not matters of politics or information or anything. That's just is the capability there institutionally and in hardware. And
I would push back against that a little bit.
Okay.
I do think that the libertarians they do get a lot of flack, but one thing they're absolutely right about is that the regulatory state has been one of the primary impediments to this
100%
from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Like
So that's
the CDC rolling into labs at the University of Washington, telling people that they can't run a frickin' PCR test because paperwork. I mean, it's like something. It ended up in a Reason magazine profile, but it is something like out of a Reason magazine profile.
right.
you know what I mean? Like it is such an obvious textbook case of bureaucratic proceduralism imposing itself on people actually trying to do things to in the public interest. And
so I just have to point out,
yeah,
like the parallels with the US story and the China story. In China, there was a doctor that realized there were a cluster of patients, tried to publicize it, raised the warning, got suppressed. There's a doctor at the University of Washington who thought she had a patient, ran a COVID-19 test in her own lab, published the results when the CDC was telling her not to, which finally got people to wake up and take this seriously. Like, which one is the totalitarian state here, right? Like
right.
they look the same.
It's almost like there are tons of functional similarities between big sclerotic land empires.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, supposedly authoritarian Singapore has been the most open and the most transparent actor in this whole thing. It's absurd. I mean, that you can literally go to the frickin' Singaporean health authorities dashboard, and they publish all these charts and graphs that are updated like instantaneously from their excellent, unified data infrastructure for all their healthcare workers, so that the public can see precisely what's going on at all times. And this is a supposedly authoritarian state, and yet they have a level of transparency that puts puts nominal democracies to absolute shame. I mean, it makes you wonder about the language we use to describe these sets of systems.
Yeah, exactly. And this has been one of our ongoing points at Palladium, as we examine different regimes around the world. The major difference, one of the major and most important dimensions, is just the competence of the regime. And
Absolutely.
A lot of the other stuff that we say about regimes, democratic, authoritarian, et cetera, tend to just be branding, tend to just be kind of the sort of high level narratives that actually don't weigh in very much on the day-to-day actual competence of the regime. So before we get too much further into continued discussion here, which is very interesting, let's start answering some questions from the audience. There's been some great discussion in the chat and some great questions. I want to start with Misha's question for Matt. If you had 100K right now, how much would that accelerate, or how long before the first masks would be rolling off the production line?
We don't know how. Yeah, okay. So I can answer that very specifically. We don't know how long it would take to roll off the production line, because we're still waiting on quotes from a couple different suppliers of ultrasonic welding equipment. Part of the issue with that is that this is a very limited infrastructure with a lot of dependencies on expensive German toys, and we can get into that another time. I think. Wolf,
right.
I'd probably owe you a piece on industrial civil disobedience. That's going to be a point.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Would love to hear that.
yeah, absolutely. It involves breaking IP law aggressively. What we could do right now is place an order with Lidl, which is one of the I think they're the second largest manufacturer of N95 melt blown, or N95 grade melt blown polypropylene, and right now we've been shaking all the trees we can find to get $100,000 or so to just go place an order with those guys, so that we can at least get in their production pipeline for early April. That would secure our ability to get this done. That's basically it. So that is what we would be able to do. We're probably going to start crowdfunding early next week, or over the weekend, but we really could use $100,000 check right now. I know exactly where I'm sending it. It would sit in our bank account for about 10 minutes.
Nice.
We can deploy capital effectively right now. I want to really underline that to anybody who's listening.
Great. And another part of that question is, are you doing this as a for-profit or non-profit kind of venture?
We're not planning on making any money off of this. Look, I'm a software engineer. I might go do manufacturing work down the road, but personal protective equipment is not something that that I find intensely interesting beyond its ability to make sure that my dad isn't walking into the ICU he runs, with a bandana around his face next week.
Right.
Yeah. So my interest in this is primarily, just wanting to ameliorate an immediate need.
Yeah.
As far as the vehicle we're using right now, we have several very excellent lawyers trying to figure out, working on a pro bono basis, for which we should thank them. We're working on figuring out what sort of vehicle that that would be appropriate for this. Push comes to shove, I'll just end up running this through my consulting LLC, and I'll take the hit on taxes. But I'd rather not, and I'd rather that people that people who would like to donate to this would be able to. In a tax deductible fashion. It definitely smooths things out quite a bit. But yeah, stay tuned to my Twitter feed, and then the at OpenPPE Project Twitter feed as well for official updates on this.
Yeah. So about the intellectual property aspect in particular, there's during wartime mobilizations, there's these interesting provisions for the government to just basically seize IP and for the war effort, and this is really the kind of case where that kind of thing needs to be happening.
Yeah.
And I think we're officially in that state of the world as of a few days ago.
Correct. Right, where they're officially on wartime footing.
Yeah.
Yeah. They invoked that act.
I'll be honest. We actually looked at 3M's design, and I don't think that's IP we want to steal.
Yeah. Okay.
Ouch.
No, I'll be honest. Like this is a category. This is a disposable respiratory personal protective equipment is a category where there's been near zero consequential innovation in the last several decades, and it's just ridiculous.
That's pathetic. Unfortunate. Yeah. All right. Bonnie asks, how long do you think life will be disrupted, and how long are we going to have to be doing the social distancing thing? Is it going to be a few months? Is it going to be a year? What do you guys think?
That really depends. Yeah, that really, really depends. In the situation where we choke this thing off effectively with our current lockdown, if we do that for a month, it's burned out of almost every host, right? There's still going to be a few floating around, but it's going to greatly shrink the numbers that we have to deal with. Then we could maybe do a South Korea, Singapore solution where we don't actually have to be all that careful.
Assuming we have the testing capacity.
Yes, the testing capacity is currently ramping up quite quickly. I'll note.
Okay, that's great to know.
But it's suffering a number of significant bottlenecks, largely because we don't build anything here, such as like reagents and even cotton swabs. Literally, we're running out of cotton swabs to test people. Like this, which I'm so furious about this whole thing. And, Matt, you're absolutely right. Like, supply chain ended up totally killing us. It totally killed us.
I really hope the next wave of look. I'm a committed, wild-eyed, ideological neoliberal. I like globalization. I think it's good. I think it's here to stay. But I really do hope the next wave of globalization is not driven by third world sweatshops. I'd like it to be driven by American robots.
Yeah, I totally hear you there. So anyway, if we manage to actually close this off, right? If we get almost everyone uninfected and then start to do contact tracing with phones, widespread testing, I think we actually don't have to change life that much, and we will contain it. If we don't contain it, then the question becomes, do we have lifelong immunity, or is this a seasonal virus? If this becomes a seasonal plague that we have to go through this every single winter, it could be a lot longer than a year, right? It could be every year.
That's what the WHO and CDC people have been saying, kind of in private communications or in journal communications. They do think it's going to go seasonal, and that this is here to stay. That
would be quite concerning. So far, it hasn't quite reached the level even of the flu. We're still actually in the early stages where this is the major impact is still pretty hypothetical, but there is nothing particularly stopping it from getting quite big.
Yeah, if you look at like syndromic surveillance, where you just like find the number of people that are having flu-like symptoms at a given point, there are certain parts of the country where it's now above peak flu season. So
Right.
it's not going to be just the flu for any longer if it's not already.
Yeah, and we're off of peak flu season, aren't we?
Oh,
Yeah.
well off now. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
that was
so
early Feb.
yeah, I remember seeing a graph with flu symptoms, and there's usually kind of a spike in sort of the winter, basically, and then we had that this year with a big spike of flu symptoms in the winter, but then we're having a second spike of flu symptoms that's starting to, yeah, again, like you said, will overtake that peak, and that must be the coronavirus, which is actually spreading, more than we're testing. Yeah, and I think that specifically was in New York, and I'm not sure if
Yes, that's right.
I'm not sure how much that generalizes at this time.
Syndromic surveillance across the country shows there are a number of regions in the country where you still don't really detect symptoms above baseline, but in several parts of the country they like clearly are, and the ones where they're not are still kind of marginal, and it's like it looks like the flu season's flattening off rather than falling, right? So those will almost certainly go like this over time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we'll see how it all plays out. This thing getting seasonal could get. I mean, eventually we would have to just go on a fairly serious campaign to squash it, because otherwise I think it would become a very serious inconvenience.
One thing
if you just let it go.
Yeah, one thing I've heard floating around public health circles is mask month. So, we pick some period of time every year where we all wear masks all the time, and that would drive basically every respiratory disease down to close to zero if we started to do that. So I'm beginning to think that might end up being a good idea. Every October or whatever, we just that's mask month, and everybody's got a surgical mask on whenever they're in public, and we just drive it down down to zero along with the common cold.
Yeah, totally. Like it's just the flu, like has made me now think we need to get rid of the flu with these same methods, right? Let's end the flu.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, why do we put up with the flu?
Absolutely.
Well, this reminds me of the Hong Kong numbers, where
every disease is falling.
Yeah, because they did an effective hygiene approach to this. The flu actually tanked as well as soon as they got word of coronavirus, which is sort of heartening, right? It's like, okay, well, maybe if we get good at crushing these things, this won't be the only one we crush.
Yeah, and to everyone who's still got residual, like, masks don't work propaganda in their decision tree somewhere, that is objectively not true.
Yes.
Masks work great. What masks do, surgical masks of the type that you see commuters wearing in Asian countries, quite wisely. What they do is they protect you from direct droplet spread, but they also catch a bunch of viral matter if you are sick or if you are an asymptomatic carrier. So when they're catching all of that viral matter, it starts to throw things, it starts to drive things down to zero. I will also say that with the all of the facial recognition technology coming out these days, the civil libertarian in me really likes the idea of a lot of people masking up in public, but we'll see.
So what do you guys think about whether this has given us enough of a wake-up call that we're going to be much more effective in the next pandemic, or are we going to substantially change our procedures here? This is a question from Jessica Dang.
You want to take this one, Will?
Oh God, I don't know, which is so tragic, right? I think some of it depends what the shape of the pandemic looks like to a certain degree, though probably respiratory viruses are the thing that would spread the fastest anyway. So this is not quite the maximally bad condition. Yeah, what do I actually think? I think the strategic reserve will have more stockpiles, which will help.
Yeah.
I I don't know whether the like international institutions are going to be better. The World Health Organization definitely seemed to be driven by politics and trying to keep relationships with China happy.
Right.
China didn't let the US CDC in early, which was another sign that this was more political than about stopping the crisis. It's tough to imagine all of these political concerns going away. I think it'll be easier to convince the population that something's more necessary, and the media might like be more on board with treating it more seriously sooner. So I do think pieces of it will be easier and pieces of it won't.
Yeah, I think
Hard question.
our existing perimeter defense systems are very good, very very good. Like I said, we are typically like outbreak to of say like a novel hemorrhagic fever in the jungle in Uganda to to MSF on the ground, like CDC and WHO on the ground attacking the problem. Like we're incredibly good at that. Where that doesn't work is central China, where where the CCP won't let people go and operate that extremely good epidemic surveillance infrastructure. So the perimeter defense stuff, I think is quite good. I'm not very optimistic though about our ability to actually contain large scale outbreaks once they do get past that perimeter defense infrastructure, because if you look at the Ebola crisis, which was very, terrifying and should have been the wake-up call that, prevented this, or if you look at the response now, the issue isn't even at the level of our public health authorities. It is at every level of Western governments. We are screwing the pooch at an enormous scale, and it's obvious that under this level of pressure, every facet of our institutions is crumbling like a paper airplane hitting the ground. It's so obvious that we just don't have the institutional gas to respond to pandemics. So right now, so if you just play out the institutional decay that has been happening for the last, at an accelerating rate for the last 40 years, you play that out another 20, up to, when we see something come out of Brazil or whatever. I don't, I don't think, ceteris paribus, we actually do a better job after this.
Yeah. Well, a lot of that,
I don't know.
A lot of this really depends on what kind of large or institutional reform this spurs, right? And this actually gets into another question from Gabriel, which is, what are sort of the possible kind of upsides in terms of institutional rebuilding as a result of this thing? I mean, societies get hit by these shocks occasionally. It really sucks in the moment. It's going to be awful, but they are also a shock that forces a renewal often. And so what do you guys think about the chance that this whole crisis spurs more widespread institutional renewal that can get us ready for the next one, but not just the next one, but kind of renew other aspects of the system? What do you guys think about that?
I think that it might. Something that's tricky about a complex system is that it's hard to predict in advance what's going to cause damage and what's going to cause an adaptive response. Yeah. And my fear is that this could end up being damage instead of adaptation. With a particularly sort of sclerotic bureaucracy, I think if there's a positive movement, it's adding another layer of bureaucracy that just overrides the other ones. Not that the other ones are going to go away, right? Both the CDC and the FDA massively dropped the ball. Do you really believe either the CDC or the FDA won't exist after this, right? Like that's hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe what we get is like the executive branch really puts its foot down and just like cuts a ton of laws, right? Like that I could see maybe happening, right? Something like if there's ever an emergency, pandemic situation, the FDA has to automatically grant the authority to run a test or something, right? Like you could imagine something like that gets enshrined, right? Largely by kind of taking away existing regulations. But I think given our current state, we're much more likely to just layer on something else than we are to actually fundamentally fix the parts that are broken.
So that's with the current ethos of the system. Matt, were you going to say something?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that we will attempt to layer something on, but I think the credibility of federal public health authorities, both in the eyes of the public and in the eyes of municipal and regional health authorities, is completely spent. I do not see university university hospitals, university research hospitals. I do not see municipal or state level public health authorities taking anything that comes out of the CDC's mouth seriously ever again, nor should they. I think when something like this comes down the pike again, it's going to end up being a much more distributed response, which means it's going to be worse in some places and better in others. And frankly, I think that's probably the outcome that's optimal.
So I think I'm actually less sure than you that the state and local authorities aren't going to listen to the national authorities. Again, I'm just updating that direction so hard, seeing this whole thing play out now.
Yeah.
That, like, none of the localities wanted to take action before they got a higher up on board.
Right.
Yeah, they were all fairly timid in this thing, even though the the force of moral righteousness was definitely with them, and the force of necessity.
I mean, certainly there were one or two notable examples. I would say, like, here in San Francisco, the mayor declared a state of public emergency before there was the first confirmed case in San Francisco, because it was obvious to everyone that it was spreading in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We got the first confirmed community spread a couple of days after she did that. Right. So, like, that's the kind of foresight which someone who's actually, like, in touch with the situation should be showing here. Right. Also, New York State, not New York City, New York State. Like, their governor has actually been on top of this thing. And
yeah, I was impressed by New York.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, they're leading the charge, But I will say, like, something that both the Bay Area and New York have is they're two of the, like, hardest to hit places currently, right?
Right.
Seattle's maybe the outlier of being even harder hit, but still not really getting ahead of the problem.
So, I don't think it's a coincidence that future governor of California, current mayor of San Diego, Kevin Faulconer, is was ahead of the curve on this, on the coronavirus situation, but also ahead of the curve on the housing situation and ahead of the curve on the homelessness situation, many months ago. So you are starting to see. A much more effective, London, as you said, London breeds early state of emergency declaration. You are starting to see a lot more state and regional authorities or state and local authorities take this sort of thing seriously. And I can't stand Andrew Cuomo, but credit where it's due. He is doing a good job with this.
So, Matt, to sort of answer your prediction that the state and local authorities might stop listening to the higher ups and start doing sort of more independent action, I think the sort of counterpoint on that is that it's very easy to imagine right when the thing is happening, things changing. It seems like a very powerful situation to change your mind, but these changes tend to need to be institutionalized for there to be a lasting consciousness of the thing. And the default really is that public memory kind of fades away. Everyone forgets about it and goes back to the kind of the standard operating procedure, whatever that is. And so I think any kind of institutional change in behavior really depends on institutional reconstruction. Changing how things work a bit.
I would put one caveat on that, which is I agree that the institutions, ideally should kind of like get this figured out and change themselves. But even with something like the 2008 financial crisis, a number of people gained status and a number of people lost status, largely because of what, like, if they saw it coming or not, and what they did.
Yes.
And like we talk about, like, Nassim Taleb, right? Who would give him any time of day at all if he didn't sound the alarm in like 2007, right?
Bro, what
like,
do you deadlift?
no one likes that guy, right? No one would listen to that guy. He's crazy, right?
Yeah, his point is much more powerful given that 2008 actually happened.
Yeah. So I think we could see something like that coming out of this, where like a small number of people like get listened to and have a platform that didn't before.
Yeah, I think that's a very important kind of prediction of how this actually affects things. I think, one of the things I've been seeing here and that I've been calling and talking about is the degree to which this is really causing the victory of certain themes in the discourse, and certain like people who have been saying things about, state capacity, who have been talking about the dangers of kind of like offshoring the entire supply chain, a large number institutional decay, a large number of issues that people have been talking about and that have been addressed in certain circles and not others. And right now, this situation is really resulting in a transfer of credibility that I think will be partially permanent. I think it won't necessarily just fizzle out. I think there will be a lot of it that fizzles out, but there will be some things that with this salient in the public imagination, certain ways of thinking are going to be seeming a lot more natural over the next couple decades. So Tanner Greer has asked a very long and complicated question. So let me just try to read through that and see what we think of it. He's currently writing a history of the United States in the 21st century. One of the extraordinary things he's noted is the amount of time elected officials spent with crisis management. And crisis management really means public relations, or as we've called it, narrative management. Many weeks, the National Security Advisor or the Security State spend more time, or the Secretary of State, spend more of their hours trying to shape the narrative and coverage of events than actually trying to shape facts on the ground. The majority of these crises are not remembered a month later. So this is the pattern of public action. Put more effort into narrative management than crisis resolution. It's been going like this for 2 decades. What do we need to do to change that? Is this just an inevitable feature of democracy caught in the grip of the news cycle, or is it possible to incentivize and focus on action instead of spin? So this is I think that's a very deep question. I'm very curious to hear what you guys have to say about that.
Tanner, when that book comes out, I will absolutely pre-order it. In fact, I'd like to read a preprint if you'd be willing to share. That sounds absolutely amazing. I think we need a greater degree of independence for essential institutions. The Fed, the Fed can go and act rapidly and without having to ask anybody. And that has been what has kept us from having a complete and total financial system collapse, as opposed to a 75% partial financial system collapse, right? Like you need people, you need unconstrained, ideologically low voltage expert institutions that can do things effectively, quickly, and impactfully. And when you don't have that, you get what we have right now. You can think back to, for example, what the British Foreign Office was able to do back in the 1800s without ever having to go check in with Parliament. They were able to conduct Britain's foreign policy almost as a peer to Parliament, rather than as a subject institution, even though Parliament could ultimately just take the funding away. I think a greater degree of institutional independence is how we avoid that trap, but I don't think that's going to happen in the current under the current American political regime. I don't think that's going to happen.
So it sounds like the answer is yes, this is an inevitable feature of a democracy, and therefore we need less democracy. This sounds kind of like the answer.
Yeah, I mean, to put some nuance on that, like we recently published a review of the book 10% Less Democracy on Palladium. And the idea there is like, okay, we don't necessarily just have to write off democracy. We can just look at the successes of institutions like the Federal Reserve and say, well, maybe we just need more of that kind of thing. What are the areas where people are getting too caught up in this narrative management stuff, and free those institutions from those pressures. And that's, so it doesn't have to be something radical, though perhaps radical things are called for, but you can imagine this just 10% less democracy version of that.
I think system of government changes are called for at this point. But
yeah. I mean, it's like interesting to use the Fed as an example, because what kind of actually makes the Fed work? Like, why can't it be independent, right? And it seems like there's this sort of one feature that folks have sort of decided gets to be handled by someone else. I mean, there's like a lot of unaccountable bureaucracy in the executive branch in general.
Right.
But we don't seem to treat it as independent. We don't seem to treat it as ruled by technocrats either. But like, what's the difference between the Fed and the entire rest of the government, right? Like,
that's a very important question.
why is the Fed different than the CDC?
Well, the Fed has a different, the Fed has a very important set of customers, the banking system. And I think that is part of why they're able to, to move independently. Now, granted, that should it necessarily be that way? Should we have that sort of monetary system? That's a point for debate. But you could do a lot worse than the setup that we presently have for monetary system management.
Yeah, I mean, something like having a CDC that was as independent as the Fed, but had the ability to shut down the entire US economy in order to stop a virus. I sort of have a hard time imagining that we would do that.
Right, but they don't necessarily need to have the authority to shut down the economy if they do have the authority to, for example, institute temperature checks on flights without having to go through Homeland Security. They could conceivably have the ability to go and essentially commandeer parts of the federal infrastructure in the public interest during emergencies, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to have. And it's very, there's plenty of precedent for it. There's this great book called Contagion. I'm pretty sure it's an academic work on sort of the spread of trade and disease from the plague of Justinian onward. And it talks a lot about how Italian city-states during times of epidemic would appoint some sort of independent council of usually a couple merchants and a couple merchants and whatever passed for doctors, usually a priest or two, and they would go take over the import-export policies of the port of Genoa or whatever, and start putting people in the lazaretto for 14 days. So that they could see if they had buboes, popping up all over their body, that sort of thing. I think it's clear that sort of institution is required in this specific instance, in addition to the perimeter defense stuff that we have.
Let's move on to another question. Bern Hobart asks, if we do test and trace, is that something that will be done by the private sector or the public sector? And does this kill HIPAA?
It should kill HIPAA, but it probably won't, is the sad thing. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, testing absolutely can be done by the private sector. Tracing is an interesting question, right? There's this very real question going on right now around who do we trust with our data? Because cell phone tracking has been one of the major things that every East Asian country that has successfully contained this has used, right? They know where every single person is because we have one of these on hand at all times. That does contact tracing for you, right? This could be a fully automated system, right? Like Palantir could just solve this problem tomorrow, right?
Given the data, yeah.
Given the data. Indeed. And we were already having this whole pre-existing debate around the role of privacy and tech companies. I'm a little bit worried that just because of the political implications, the private sector is not going to want to do it. And for a lot of reasons, I think the public sector isn't necessarily going to be able to swallow that, and people just go along with it.
Well,
So
even if you could swallow it and get the mandate to do it, just like negotiating the transfer of data between agencies, like who actually has the data, right? Who has access to that surveillance data? And I guess like police
well,
can
we know through
subpoena it,
Prism
or
the NSA has access to a lot of that data, or at least it did
do
Yeah,
they have?
for
until
foreign entities
Snowden.
only.
Yeah,
But do they have
exactly.
channels of information sharing with the rest of the government?
They
And
shouldn't.
there's a
Not
lot
a
of
chance.
right. There's a lot
But
of there's a lot of sort of institutional barriers there that aren't just will. I think.
I am terrified of the security state implications of this. I think that they're going to use this as a power grab, and I think they're going to get away with it in
Yeah,
part.
as one does.
As I said earlier, you have messages disappearing on Twitter right now as if we're working on Western Weibo, and it's I think that's an indicator of things to come, and I think it's completely unnecessary to go do that, because you can go look at Hong Kong, where trust in government is basically zero, and they were able to stop this completely with a bottom up implementation of everybody just going and wearing masks. You really don't need to get a whole lot more complicated than people just practicing practicing good sanitation. And
Good luck getting Americans to do anything sort of public
in a
spirited.
coordinated, well, it doesn't even need to be public spirited. It can just be
But
panic or
Purely
self-preservation driven.
self-interested.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's incredibly naive to suggest that we need to go knock down firewalls that we have against the security state. Firewalls that we have against the security state, extending its power, to go implement only one version of a workable solution to something like this. I think that people who suggest a massive deployment of the security state to go fix this are clueless and do not realize how many guns there are in this country.
well, yeah. So
Yeah.
a more restrained statement of what you're saying is that there are.
I don't do restraint statements.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, but this is a responsible publication that we have to do very restrained statements of all these things. But
Of course.
no. But I think to just rephrase, there are important barriers within the government and discipline about how we use the powers that we have that ought to be maintained. And what you're saying,
Right.
I think, or related to what you're saying, is that some of these things, especially around the role of the security state domestically, those barriers and those sort of limitations in how we use the power may be more important than sort of the expedience of the moment. And we should be kind of keeping a vigilance on the larger question of disciplined government, not just the immediate need. And like you said, there are many other ways to solve this. Yeah. Though, yeah, I'm not necessarily sort of taking one side or the other. I'm just kind of trying to phrase how I understand what you're saying.
Yeah,
I guess I wonder, representation of it.
Is there any way by which we can plausibly expect the government to like hand this power back after they use it, right? Like, is there any way, shape, or form, any institution, any structure we could set up that could actually guarantee that it's just this once?
No.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? It's very difficult once you get a ball rolling to stop the ball from rolling. Once you have a bureaucracy that's job is to kind of go and surveil people for public health issues, then that it's going to find ways to continue operating. And so that's why I think the sort of discipline is and foresight is especially warranted in these
Right.
things. Whenever you're spinning up some new piece of machinery, you got to be careful. Is this something we actually want to be sticking around? Mm-hmm. And in many cases you want to think very hard, the way we do about laws, or at least we ought to, about laws and precedents. Before
yeah. I do still wonder if there's a purely private solution to the tracing problem that does rely on basically mass voluntary sort of opting in, and like
right.
very selective reveal of necessary data, sort of if and only if you have been exposed, right? Like
isn't that the way Korea or Singapore did it? Like there was some, I thought I saw something to that effect that someone had actually done this voluntary thing where everyone downloads an app. The app kind of keeps track of where you are, and I think somehow they notify you if you've been in contact with someone, and then allows you to then upload your data. And so it's in a way where it's the data is not being centrally collected, but is being submitted in a decentralized way that keeps there from being a central database of like general purpose, where has everyone been? I'm not sure whether that actually happened, but I thought I saw something to that effect.
Yeah, I should probably look into the implementation details a little bit closer, but I didn't think there were any that were voluntary, universal, and private.
Mm-hmm.
I could be wrong.
Yeah, I'm not sure how these things work. It would be very good to look into that. We should definitely do that. So Anirudh asks, do we think the media will face any repercussions for this? Will there be anything that's going to change the journalism industry out of this?
Nope.
Nope.
Yeah, no, I think that's sort of a fair.
That was our fastest answer yet.
Yeah, I mean, their incentive structure is chaos. They love chaos. I mean, the press is absolute trash and has been absolute trash throughout this whole process, and probably will continue to do so. When I say that, I mean particularly the press release and hot take driven political press. Vox, for example, just they really showed their true colors throughout all of this. So we'll see.
Yeah, I don't think there's anyone there that's going to forcibly hold their feet to the fire.
Of course not. Of course not.
Why would they change?
Yeah. I mean, they haven't. They haven't. There have been zero internal repercussions for for the stories that they wrote earlier on that now have that will have body.
Yeah. So another question from Peter. He's curious about the backstory. What's going on behind the split between testing capacity and personal protective equipment availability? They are, the testing is at least ramping up, but the personal protective equipment is still quite scarce. What are the kind of factors in American industry that are accounting for that?
So I know the testing story pretty well, and I know pieces of the protective equipment story, but I think Matt can probably do that one better.
Yeah, you do testing, I'll do PPE.
Sure. So there are lots of labs throughout the U.S. that are very, very good that basically could have gotten a test up and running at any point. And generally, the FDA is a little bit looser with a diagnostic test. Particularly, there are categorizations that are basically tests that are sort of only used by the doctor for informational purposes. Those are generally regulated much more loosely. So there are very, very broad certifications that the FDA can give you that will allow you to basically just do whatever you want in the lab. If you aren't like handing someone a drug, right? If it's like literally just a test. The problem is that once the CDC declared that this was an emergency situation, it activated a different pathway inside the FDA, something called emergency use authorization. And that meant every time someone wanted to run a test for this virus, they had to get a waiver from the FDA that allowed them to do that.
Oh, man.
And the FDA wrote...
What's the justification for that?
So supposedly what they're trying to do is they're trying to stop just anyone off the street from, selling their COVID-19 test that is, obviously false, right? And just selling that to make a profit at expense of folks who are scared. So what the FDA did, they gave an emergency use authorization only to the CDC. So they gave a legal monopoly only on the CDC. So then it was up to the CDC to make all the test kits that we would need, right? They botched it. The CDC literally messed up the test. They didn't get the reagents right for the test. They ended up particularly trying to make a much more complicated test. It wasn't just yes or no, do you have COVID? It was trying to like diagnose a whole range of different diseases, not just COVID, so that you could actually do like one test and then say, oh, well, you have the flu or this or that or COVID, right? We just needed a yes or no, do you have COVID test. So it was overcomplicated and they blew it. So it took about a month later, but the FDA finally said, all right, we'll give emergency use authorizations to any of those labs that we'd previously allowed to just do diagnostic testing in general. And that's it. All they had to do was just make that one change, and it took them a month. So now everyone is scrambling, trying to get the testing up and running because they weren't legally allowed to do it. And as we mentioned, a doctor at the University of Washington was the one who illegally did the test to inform people that COVID was spreading in the community.
And they weren't spinning up the tests in anticipation that they might be allowed real soon.
I mean, a few people have, right? For research purposes, right? Which is how we started to find out about community spread at all, because the CDC produced 0 viable tests after like a few hundred. So that was just an absolute horror show. The FDA finally changed their mind. Now every lab in the country is scrambling to get it up and running now that they can. And what we're finding is we don't make reagents in the country. We don't make cotton swabs in the country.
Oh,
right?
man.
So every lab now is fighting for supplies. Like there are universities sending out emails to the alumni saying like, hey, if you're like a tinkerer and you have some of these tools like sitting around, can you send it to our lab? Right? Like that's the level of just crazy scramble in this system, which, you know, quite frankly, like should have been on this, 2 months ago.
Huh. Interesting. And Matt, how's the personal protective equipment side look like?
So the question was, how did we get here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's the macro, and then there's the macro reasons for this, and then there's the specific reasons. So back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, obviously tons and tons of stuff got offshore. One of the things that got offshore is, basically any sort of, small single-use plastic widget. That sadly involves, basically all disposable personal protective equipment.
Yeah.
So basically all of that got moved overseas. Over the years, Kimberly-Clark was one of the last companies to finally make the jump, and they did so because everybody was feeling cost pressures, and everybody wanted to shave a few pennies off of the masks they were using. So they moved it all overseas. The government made the determination that, since of course we have this great perimeter defense infrastructure, pandemics don't happen anymore. We solved that problem. So they cut they cut the national stockpile down. We only have 50 million of them sitting around. I think last I checked. Almost all of those have been, are in the process of being deployed right now. They'll run out in, very shortly here. Many of them won't even make it to hospitals. So that's the macro reason. We don't make things here anymore. We're an industrially hollowed out country that decided at a strategic level a little while back that it was a good idea to take manufacturing of almost everything, with the exception of aerospace components, some cars, and a few other little things. And we decided to go move that overseas. And I think that's a big discussion that we need to have after this. Do we want American robots to be doing this, or do we want overseas sweatshop workers to be doing this?
Well, we got a lot of BS jobs that could be redeployed into manufacturing as well.
Yes, we do. I couldn't agree more.
We've got a lot of human workers as well available.
95% of the people working in HR would be better social, or would be of greater social utility on a factory floor. So there's that.
And
In
then the
terms of the
micro.
immediate problem, basically the outbreak started in China, and as soon as the outbreak started, PRC basically using a number of different laws that they that they have on the books, nationalized just a ton of different production capacities all over the place. One of the things they also did is they went and bought up almost the whole world's stockpile supply of melt-blown N95 N95 grade melt-blown polypropylene, which is the primary filter media that people use. So we the machinery for melt-blown is not for turning melt-blown polypropylene into masks is not that complicated at all, which is why my team and I have are able to address this. But the problem quickly became lack of this material, and most of the fabricators for this are in China. There are some in the European Union, there are some in the United States, but the lion's share is in China. And what we're dealing with right now is an upstream scarcity in addition to the lack of manufacturing capability here in the States. So beyond that, the macro case and the macro situation and the immediate material scarcity, we just didn't have enough of these things stockpiled. There was a conscious decision to under prepare for something that people considered to be unlikely, and here we are.
Oh man. Wow, that's a fairly good answer to that question as far as what happened here, and what's the comparison between the test kits and the personal protective equipment. Chris Gillette asks, why is this particular event going to drive change? How is this particular event going to drive change? A lot of people are optimistic that it's going to change things. Why will this particular event change or not change things? I think we've touched on some of these aspects already, some of these questions, but I think there's more to say there. Just like, what is this going to sort of break the camel's back on things, or is this just another kind of blip in the news cycle? Ultimately, even if it's a big one. There were other things that showed serious dysfunction: Katrina, 2016 election, before that Iraq war. It's been becoming obvious that there's something seriously wrong with the system for a while. Is this going to be the different one, or is it going to be more of the same?
Yeah, I think with like each of those examples, I could sort of come up with a story in each case why it didn't result in change. With like Iraq and Afghanistan, like it was mostly volunteers, right? And these were mostly volunteers from like parts of the country that the coastal elites have no exposure to, right? And like we took on more debt to fight those wars, but like we seemingly have an infinite capacity to finance our state, right? So like
debt is just numbers and some wizardry.
Yeah, and it's like sort of horrible to say that, but I think that's how it is to almost everyone in the country. Similarly with Katrina, or like more recently, there was a huge hurricane that like destroyed Puerto Rico, right? And like that was just a blip for Trump, right? And like I don't know if that's just because it's regional or something like that. I mean, look, we were both pretty skeptical about how much this is actually going to change things, but I think my case for it changing things is that literally 100% of the U.S. population is caught up in this now, right?
Yeah, we're all at risk.
I mean, things changed during 9/11, right? Things changed a little during the financial crisis, but not as much as they should have. So there are examples of profound change, though I think you can argue whether, again, that's damage or an adaptive response.
I on the Puerto Rico point, actually, I do think it's important to note that a lot of those people moved to Florida, and they all, to a person, think that Trump is an incompetent buffoon. I think correctly, and that could very easily cost him the state this year. All of the people who moved to Miami and change their voter registration to a place where they're no longer, despite being U.S. citizens, no longer second-class citizens. So that's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, this is in many ways a much bigger and harder to contain issue than a lot of these other things. This is going to be something that affects everybody. I mean, certainly, we're all seeing the changes in our lives from it quite directly. Most of us haven't had friends get sick yet. But we might get there, and then that might have.
I know a couple people that are sick now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I've heard of a couple cases that fortunately turned out not to be the coronavirus. There were a few friends that had scares, but I don't know anyone directly who's stricken by this thing yet.
I have one that has an actual positive test, and then a few people who think that they have it but have not been able to get a test, and we may never know. Well,
that's there's definitely a lot of not able to get a test going around.
My dad's gonna get it,
right? Because he's frontline.
He's frontline in an ICU. Yeah, so I'm just I'm mentally preparing myself for that, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm pretty scared.
Yeah.
I hear you, man.
Yeah, that's hard. So Peter asks another question. Will the U.S. be able to enforce a lockdown? For how long? How will democratic lockdown be narratively distinguished from Chinese lockdown?
Sorry, I apologize.
Yeah, let's make this the last question. There's no way we're going to get through everything, but
there's no chance of actually being able to enforce a lockdown in this country. That's absurd. I mean, the only thing that's going to actually happen is you're going to do an enormous amount of unnecessary economic damage. I mean, this is another area where the libertarians actually probably deserve a little bit of credit. The whole Hayekian, like, you do not understand the economy, you cannot compute the economy, is going to that whole thing is going to become evident to a lot of people when non-essential businesses suddenly become, when you realize that shutting down non-essential businesses, they're in this, like, how in the world are hospital cafeterias going to stay open when they're, when the people who sell their napkins are shut down? I mean, it is classic managerial hubris to think that we can go and actively shut down an economy without causing enormous, immediate, potentially politically destabilizing harm. The extreme lockdowns that we're seeing right now, I mean, the one in Chicago, they're calling it the stay-at-home rule, but if you actually look at the implementation of it, it's martial law with a friendly face. And there's no way people are going to react well to that. When the economic implications of that start to pan out, you will have riots in places. We've already seen the first coronavirus riots on college campuses. With kids drunkenly brawling with cops. I think when the chemical factor is not being able to buy food because your grocery store shelves aren't stocked in a week or two from now, and not a bunch of ethyl alcohol in your bloodstream, I think we're going to start to see a lot of extreme repercussions.
So I think it's probably the first time I'm going to heavily disagree with Matt here. We've been on the same page up until this point, I think. I think the U.S. is going to successfully implement a lockdown. I don't think that it has to be very long. Right. Just given what we know about this virus, even doing it for a few weeks will help enormously, right? And like a month, I think basically almost all of us can get through that, right? Like, I don't think we're going to see serious disruptions to food supply. I totally agree. If we did, then I would expect riots. But like,
right,
they've been rolling out over the course of this last week, and like San Francisco is just quieter, right? And like, I don't think it's going to be much different on the second week than the first week or the third week or the fourth week. Like,
people will get antsy and start going outside again. There might be, like, when enforcement starts having to happen, that might be the thing.
I could see that, but like the order, at least here in San Francisco and now all of California, allows you to go out for a walk. You just can't hang out with people.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Well,
So I predict that it's going to be pulled off, and I think it will end up being pretty damaging to the economy, just what we're seeing on like unemployment rolls.
Right.
But I think the policy response to that economic dislocation will be the difference between, you know, mass unemployment and a temporary blip.
yeah, totally.
I think
Well-
the factors that are at play here, I mean, whenever anyone's looking at this, particularly from the perspective of somebody who has a remote work friendly tech job or whatever, you know, I'm speaking for myself in this case. You know, I think that there can be a tendency sometimes to underestimate the extreme precarity in which many American workers actually live. And that I think is what's feeding into my model. I also don't think we're going to have a month of lockdown. I think we're going to have several months of badly enforced lockdown that'll allow viral spread to continue. So I don't know. That's why I think if we did keep it to a 1 month somewhat effective lockdown, I think the outcome that, you know, you're talking about would come to pass. But I really don't think that's gonna be what we're going to get, because I haven't seen any indication that we have the institutional capability to do that well. You know, whether it's delivering meals to old people who are locked inside, or whether it's having consistent enforcement of quarantine rules by our famously excellent police forces. So yeah, I think.
Yeah. Well, this is a good issue to end on, because it's some bold predictions there, some controversy. I guess we'll see where it all plays out over the next few weeks.
Yes,
Thank you so much, guys, for coming on. This has been a fantastic discussion. I've really enjoyed your perspectives here. I think it's been very informative, and I've loved the conversation that our audience has been having in the chat. And so thanks as well to the audience for tuning in, and thanks everyone outside for listening. So this was great. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, everybody. Adios.
Yeah, bye.